Hey everybody, welcome back to our next lecture. So today we're going to start to dig into this idea of waves of terrorism. So this is going to be, I think, a good opportunity for us to start thinking about the broad context of terrorism in a modern context, in the modern world. And we're going to be looking at it through this idea of what we call waves of terrorism. This was an idea advanced by a scholar named David Rappaport, who largely thought in the modern era we could classify terrorist attacks and ideologies behind terrorism into what he thought were four distinct waves. And we're going to dig into those today. So, before we get into that, though, I really want to start out looking at some of these ideas of brief introduction into the idea of pre-modern terrorism. But most of what we'll focus on today will be looking at more the modern concept of terrorism starting in the mid to early 1800s going forward. So, who do we think about when we talk about pre-modern terrorism? So there's some debate about how we think about terrorism before the modern age. And that's especially because of the issue of the capacity for mass communication. So we don't end up in a situation where we have mass media until really the 1800s to a large extent, when we have mass production of newspapers as sort of the first real way for one, we have increases in literacy rate, and two, availability and a means for information to be distributed to a wide range of people. So that's why, in a lot of ways, there are real questions about thinking about terrorism prior to the modern era, because if we think terrorism communication of a message, instilling mass fear is a major component of it, as we talked about in our definitions, well, you need the ability for information to spread extensively for terrorism to become, perhaps what we think of in the modern context. But there are some scholars who have argued that there's some of these elements of pre-modern terrorists. And some of the first recorded terrorist incidents that scholars have focused on were by this group called the Sicarii Zealots. And these were radical Jewish assassins in around the first century BC who really wanted to go about ending Roman rule. So the Roman Empire controlled what is now currently Israel, Palestine, in the first century BCE. And these radical Jewish zealots wanted to end Roman rule of their particular area. So what they would do is they would have these individuals go into large crowds, especially of Roman citizens, and they would use the knives that you see depicted here to stab as many people as possible and then slip it back into the crowd and disappear. And this was an idea, again, as we've talked about in our previous discussions of definitions of terror, this means of trying to instill fear while also having a particular agenda that they were trying to achieve. So this is what some scholars argue as a good example of pre-modern terrorism. But again, there's elements of how we think about it based on really the lack of mass media for these groups to communicate their particular messages. But if we think about it in a more localized concept, the capacity for perhaps these events to trigger fear in particular cities where they were carrying out their actions, say Jerusalem, then perhaps we can think about this maybe in a more modern context of terror. We think word of mouth having the capacity to spread quickly in individual cities, even in ancient times, maybe this still deserves to be considered terrorism. So this is just one example we could think of when we think about this pre-modern idea of terrorism. But when we really get to the origins of modern terrorism, we see the first use of this term terror and then trying to extrapolate into the idea of terrorism really being brought about and used in relation to the French Revolution. And this is interesting, and we're going to have a lot of discussion about this in some future classes about the idea of what we call state terrorism, the idea that governments can carry out terrorism, versus non-state terrorism, which is largely going to be the focus of this class. We're looking at groups and individuals who are not part of the government who are carrying out these acts. And this is who we generally think of when we talk about terrorists. There's an important discussion to be had about state terrorism versus non-state actors who engage in terrorism, which we're going to have. We look at state terrorism, but for now and for most of the course, we're going to be thinking about terrorism in this non-state framework. But interestingly, when we see terrorism brought about in the modern context, one of the first definitions we see comes in relation to the idea of state terrorism. And Maximilien Robespierre, in his quote here, argues that terror is nothing else than immediate justice, severe and flexible. It is therefore an outflow of virtue. It is not so much a specific principle than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing need of the motherland. And so, in this framework, Maximilien Robespierre, who was a leader in the French Revolution and a French politician, really saw the use of terror, in this case by the state, as a means of achieving goals and what he sees as ultimately achieving justice and achieving what's needed for a society, even if it has the consequences of instilling fear in a population. And so, in this context, actually, we see it used in the framework of state terrorism, but what we're really going to focus on now is the idea of this non state actor terrorism for looking at the modern four waves of terrorism. So let's jump into those now. So the first wave of terrorism that we see is this issue of what we call anarchist terrorism. And so just to give you a preview, each wave of terrorism is classified by the particular ideology or objective that David Rappaport argued that a large number of different groups around the world subscribe to justify their terrorist actions and what drove them to use terrorism to achieve their objectives. So this first wave is the idea of anarchist terrorism. So anarchists are individuals who really want to advocate for the disintegration of government. In a lot of ways, some anarchists oftentimes have leanings towards particular types of governments. They may want to dissolve a government they see as more democratic and capitalist and move towards more authoritarian or socialist. So there can sometimes be a blending of anarchism with other ideologies, but for the most part, anarchists really want to end a particular type of government. They want a society that doesn't really have a strong centralized government in a lot of respects. And one of the places we really see anarchist movements start to emerge was in Russia in the 1800s. And this really was a result of the authoritarian government that existed in Russia, ruled by the czars, and who had ruled Russia for hundreds and hundreds of years as authoritarian governments who enslaved most of their population as serfs up until the 1850s. So a lot of these Russian early terrorists want to overthrow this traditional society. They want to end the rule of the czars. And so we really see their usage of assassinations as a primary tactic to achieve their objectives, to end what they see as the oppressive Russian government. They want to take out various leaders. They try to kill czars. They try to kill high-ups, royalty in the Russian government to try and bring about a collapse of the Russian governmental system. And so we see this tactic then starting to spread other places around the world after its emergence really in Russia. We see anarchists are really in a lot of ways, some ways responsible for the outbreak of the first World War, when a Serb national named Jaroslav Princip assassinated Archduke Ferdinand and helped ultimately bring about the initiation of World War I. And he was a Serbian anarchist, Serbian nationalist, and really wanted to bring about the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we can see these early anarchists can have a pretty significant impact on their particular societies, and even in some instances, like as you said with Princip, help bring about the initiation of World War I. And so this really is the first wave of terrorism that David Rappaport discusses. The next wave of terrorism that he focuses on and classifies is what he calls these anti-colonist terrorists or anti-colonialist terrorists. And this really is from this period from about the 1920s to the 1960s, when we see a real movement around the world, movements around the world to try to overthrow colonial empires, French, British, Italian, American, a lot of these countries that have colonial holdings during this 40-year period of time have to deal with a lot of groups that really want to end colonial rule, gain independence, and are willing to use, in a lot of respects, some terrorist tactics to try to achieve their objectives. So one good example of this is the emergence of the Irish Republican Army to combat the British. And even after Ireland gains independence from the UK in the early 1920s, the United Kingdom still controls Northern Ireland, a chunk of the island of Ireland in the northern part that to this day still is controlled by the British. And the IRA actively works to try and push out the British government and reunite the island of Ireland. So we see a significant spread of anti-colonialist terrorist groups across the world to try to end these previously repressive forms of government that oftentimes allowed very little input from their populations that they ruled to have any say in their governmental system, economic system, and really work towards trying to gain independence. And a lot of times the various groups were willing to use these terrorist tactics to achieve those objectives. But by the 1960s, this wave of terrorism starts to peter out to some extent because by the 1960s, huge chunks of the world, especially Africa, Asia, have gained their independence from their previous colonial rulers. And so this wave of terrorism in some ways dies out to some extent based on the fact that most of these countries' colonial holdings at this point have become independent. So then we get to the third wave of terrorism, which Rappaport calls the New Left. And this is where we see this really movement from the 1960s to the 1990s of leftist, communist revolutionaries who are willing to engage in terrorist acts to try to bring about a global ideological shift. So when we, at the end of World War II, we end up with really the world divided between the capitalist West and communist East, to break it down in the most simplistic terms possible. But there becomes this large ideological struggle throughout the world between whether countries, groups are going to support the Soviet Union or whether they support the United States and its allies. And so we see a significant spike in terms of the number of groups who subscribe to more communist ideologies carrying out terrorist attacks around the world. We see this in especially places like Latin and South America. We see groups like the Shining Path in Peru, who were a communist group that carried out a number of terrorist attacks across Peru in especially the 1970s, 1980s. We see groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This is a nationalist organization that wants Palestinian independence, Palestinian homeland, also merging its ideology with a more leftist, communist leading ideology. And this group carrying out attacks against Israel to try to gain their independence, but also promote a left-wing economic ideology. And so we see these movements around the world really carried out extensively through this period. But it really starts to peter out by the 1990s, especially because the Soviet Union collapses. And also the communist Chinese government has also started to become more capitalistic to a certain extent. But especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see a winding down of these particular types of organizations. They received lots of funding and support from the Soviet Union in their attempts to try to overthrow governments that they thought were perhaps more right-wing or more aligned with the United States. And once the Soviet Union collapses, the funding for a lot of these groups starts to dry up as well. And also the idea of a worldwide communist revolution really essentially kind of fades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which really was the main propagator of the ideology, financial supporter of groups who wanted to promote the ideology abroad. And in some ways, it's the failure of the Soviet Union, to some extent, it's seen as a failure of communist ideology. And so this really plays a big role in the petering out of this third wave of terrorism that really sought to use terrorism to try to promote a communist, Marxist revolution around the world, and using terrorism as a tactic to do so. So this is why we see the third wave of terrorism largely peter out. But then we also start to see the emergence of the fourth wave of terrorism, which Rappaport says is really very religiously motivated, and looks at it in terms of the rise of religiously motivated terrorism around the world. Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, there's lots of groups that start to emerge in the 1980s. And what many argue, if we think about these waves of terrorism, that this fourth wave is still ongoing today. And this wave of terrorism is still ongoing today, and we really see it emerging really in the 1980s. And some have argued that it largely began after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, helped spark a revival of more Islamically motivated terrorism around the world. We see this especially with the capacity of the Afghani Mujahideen, who sought to push back against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was an atheist, subscribed to a largely atheist ideology, and a lot of individuals who fought in Afghanistan sought to push back against these atheist invaders. Osama bin Laden actually was a major leader in pushing back the Soviet Union. And with the success of the Iranian Revolution, small groups of forces like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, this inspired a lot of groups to think that these small religious groups could have powerful impacts against large players. And so this helped inspire a lot of religiously motivated terrorists to start to take up their action. We also see in the United States the emergence and really taking off of the culture war. So we see an emergence and strengthening of groups like Christian terrorists like the Army of God, who bomb abortion clinics and have tried to kill abortion doctors. So we see this emerging in the 1980s. And some have also linked the emergence of religious terrorism in the 1980s and going up to the present, and especially up to 2000, with this idea of in end times. A lot of religious cults subscribe to the idea of the year 2000 bringing about the Armageddon. So a lot of religious groups, wanted to usher that in. And so we really see this emergence of religious terrorism becoming much more of an issue in the 1980s, and still dealing with it in the present. In the case study we're going to look at next, we're going to look at this picture here. You see the Time magazine, this cult of doom. This is a Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, it's a fusion of religion cult in Japan called Shinrikyo, that carried out an extremely deadly chemical weapons attack, terrorist attack in Japan. And we'll use that to try to highlight some of these elements of this fourth wave of religious terrorism, allow us to dig a little bit more into it. So that really is what we see is and argued is what the fourth wave of terrorism is: religiously motivated terrorism that seems to have spiked around the world across various different faiths. So I'm going to end here with the two discussion questions that we're going to have from this lecture. The third will be in the case study. So discussion question 1 is, why might it be ineffective to think about terrorism in waves? Again, discussion question 1. Why might it be ineffective to think about terrorism in waves? We talked a lot about thinking about terrorism since the 1880s in these various categories of waves. So the question is, again, why might it be ineffective to think about terrorism in waves? And then discussion question 2 is, if you had to guess what might cause a new wave of terrorism, what would you predict? Why? Again, discussion question 2, if you had to guess what might cause a new wave of terrorism, what would you predict? Why? All right, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you again soon.